right, Bayside, how are we doing today? Awesome. Hey, let's take a moment while we're clapping. Let's welcome all of our campuses and everyone joining us online. Can we give it up for them? So honored that you guys have joined with us today. My name is Matt. I am the Next Generation pastor here at Bayside. And so honored to be with you guys here for our very first ever Next Generation Takeover. Come on, let's make some noise for that. And honestly, listen, I just want to say thank you to Pastor Randy and Miss Amy, honestly, for 15 years of really believing in the next generation, for making an impact and an investment in all of our young people. So honored and grateful for lead pastors who value the next generation. And so honored that we get to have this weekend here. I want to tell you guys this, I don't know if you realize, but everything you've seen today, I don't know if you noticed the cameras being run by students, all of the videos you just saw, all the graphics on the screens, all of that stuff was created by our students right here at Bayside. It really is a joy and an honor to be with you guys today sharing at our Next Generation Takeover weekend. And I thought it would be fitting to do something a little bit different. And so at the beginning of my message here, I want to do something a little different. And I want to invite a panel of our students to come out. So can we welcome these students as they make their way out to the platform? Awesome. So what I want to do is, guys, why don't you just real quick, why don't you introduce yourself? So why don't you just tell them your name, what grade you're in, and maybe what ministry you're a part of here at Bayside.
Yeah, I'm Claudia. I'm in 8th grade, and I'm a part of Fusion.
I'm Bryce. I'm a junior, and I'm with Epic.
And my name is Will, and I'm entering my second year at SU Bayside.
All right. Awesome. So really what I want to do, guys, is I just want you guys, we're going to take a few minutes, and I want you guys just to kind of share with Bayside as a whole here how God has impacted your life here at Bayside, being a part of our Next Generation Ministries. And so why don't we kick it off by, why don't each of you guys just kind of talk about what your relationship with God looks like today, and maybe how being a part of Bayside and some of the ministries here have helped that relationship with God to grow. So whoever wants to kick us off.
Yeah, so 2 years ago, I really didn't have a relationship with God, and I really didn't know what it meant. I didn't know that there were people who welcome you into their lives and share a huge part of it with you. And I just am so thankful and so grateful that I have a family here who supports me and encourages me, and it's just so awesome to be a part of.
Awesome.
So I grew up in a Christian home all my life, but I never really took my relationship with God all that seriously. I was young and innocent. I didn't know really how serious the situation was. And so when I got to Bayside, it was kind of a culture shock, because I was kind of like, wow, Jesus is real. It's pretty obvious to me now. And my relationship with God shifted from me talking a lot about God to talking to God. And that was a huge shift in my life. So.
That's good.
Yeah, and I can sort of relate with Bryce. Like, I grew up in a Christian home, and I knew about God, but I really didn't start my personal relationship with God until I came to Bayside in high school. You know, I grew up in Epic, and that's where I really learned more about worship, more about prayer, and that's where I got baptized. So my relationship with God has really kicked off here at Bayside, and it's because of all the encouragement and all the guidance of all the leaders around me. Like, because of what they have told me, and they've helped me along this walk, I've been able to deepen my relationship with God, thanks to them.
That's awesome. I love it. Talk a minute, because you guys just kind of all talked about how your relationship with God has grown here being a part of Bayside. Maybe tell them about one or two kind of moments that, as you kind of think back over your time here at Bayside and being involved, think about one or two moments that have really just had a huge impact on your relationship with God and your life as a whole, and maybe just kind of talk about one or two of those moments that have really been impactful for you.
I think the first big moment for me was when I was on a missions trip last year. Missions trips are insanely impactful, and if you haven't been on one, I definitely encourage you to go. But I was in Scotland last year, actually, and it was the first time that I really saw God working in my own life, because I was serving a lot in the church. You do a lot of things. God moves in you to work for other people, but then seeing Him work in my life and through me was a giant impact for me. Like, I was able to pray for a man who was like a devout atheist, and he allowed us to pray for him, and he had been having wrist pains for his entire life, and he had no mobility in it. And so we laid hands on him, and throughout the prayer, I could just see him kind of starting to flex his wrist. And I was like, dang, God's working right now. And it was
That's
the
awesome.
most amazing thing I've ever experienced.
That's awesome.
One thing for me that was super impactful, and it happens every year, is 12 conference, man. Like if you have not been to 12 conference and you're in middle school and high school, you really need to go. And it happens to me like every year. I always get this realization. But every year when I'm just here surrounded by just like hundreds of middle schoolers and high schoolers that love God, that just shows me that like, dang, there is hope for this next generation. And so it happens every single year. I'm like, God is doing something special, not only in this church, but in the next generation as a whole. So every year, God opens my eyes to that.
Yeah.
And just, man, the next generation has something special. And so 12 Conference always opens up my eyes to something new.
That's cool. That's you, Claudia.
Well, getting involved at church has definitely impacted me a ton. Seeing leaders and students come together and just praise and worship God is so amazing to watch. And definitely I've learned so much every single day through students and through my other leaders, and it's just so awesome.
That's really cool. That's really cool. That's awesome. I know, Bryce, you talked a little bit about missions, and so I know that some of you guys have been on missions. Will, I think you've been on a few mission trips. Would you talk about maybe one of those and kind of just like a moment or how that impacted you going on some of the mission trips with Next Gen?
Yeah, back when I was a part of Epic, when I was in high school, I got the opportunity to go to Guatemala with Epic. And just a lot of crazy stuff happened there. One thing that was really cool that we got to do, we got to build a house for a family of about like 8 or 9. And so picture yourself in your house and your bathroom, you know, not that big, but like even smaller than that. There was this family of 8 living in a little shack like that. It was just a mom and like 7 or 8 kids. And they only had one bed, and so they had nothing. And so we got the opportunity to build them a nice house. Like in Guatemala standards, it was a nice house, and that just really opened my eyes and showed me like, we here have so much, and the people over there, they don't have anything, but they're thankful for everything they have. Yeah. So just seeing the look on her face when we built that house, man, she just started crying, and it was just so inspiring. Like missions, like I highly encourage you to go on mission trips. God does some crazy stuff on mission trips.
Yeah, that's good. That's good. Bryce, I know that Bryce, that you have gotten involved. I know you started attending the church in Epic, but I know now that you're involved and you're like a student leader in Epic. So talk a little bit about that, what you do in Epic, and like how that's impacted you and helped you kind of grow and develop as a leader.
Yeah, so I'm the service coordinator for our Wednesday night services for Epic, and it's one of the most fulfilling things that I've ever done, because my entire life I've been prophesied over and things have been spoken over me that I'd be in ministry. And I'm like, that's all well and good, but I'm not seeing it right now. But the leaders here saw that in me and were able to reinforce and were able to invest in me. And now I'm walking in that calling, and it's the most fulfilling thing that I've ever done in my life. So
that's awesome. That's cool. In that same kind of vein, Will, why don't you talk about, so I know you started out, you came, you got connected and really involved in our high school ministries here, and then you're in SCU Bayside, and you're pursuing, I know, the call of God in your life. So why don't you talk a little bit about kind of what got you to that point? Like, when did you feel like God spoke to you and like called you to be a part of ministry, and kind of what led you to that, on that kind of that journey?
Yeah, just one thing that really helped me walking in the doors of Bayside is just how open and welcoming everyone is. Like, I walked into Epic for the first time, and I was greeted by our youth pastor, Joe Mateer, just screaming my name the entire night. And I'm like, man, this guy is crazy. But he made me feel right at home. And that's been true in like every single part of Bayside I've walked into. It's just the volunteers and just the people we have here. They're so welcoming, and they'll make you feel right at home. And so it's just a good place to fail. They make it comfortable for you. So they give you a good environment to sort of grow in that. And all of those steps have led me to, you know, I want to pursue a calling here. I want to get plugged into ministry. And so I decided to go to SU Bayside. And I've gotten so many opportunities. I've learned so much about leadership, and just everything from the leaders I've been around, and everyone throughout the church has just played a part in that.
That's cool, man. That's awesome. That's really cool. Claudia, why don't you speak about, I know you started coming a couple of years ago to Bayside, and so why don't you talk a little bit about, I know that sometimes we have students across all of our campuses who or maybe a little bit intimidated to step into one of our youth environments, Fusion or Epic, at one of our campuses that first time. And so why don't you talk about what was that like for you that first time kind of stepping in? And
So yeah, I can definitely relate because it all looks very intimidating, and you kind of just are in shock the first time that you walk in because you don't know anyone, you might not want to talk to anyone, but the people at Fusion, at Epic, like everyone is just so nice, so sweet, and they're just so in love with God, and that's what I so much, like I just love it so much.
That's awesome. I love that. I love that. Here's what I want to do, and we'll kind of wrap it up here, guys, but I want you guys, maybe just each of you, if you could, just talk about how, think about a moment or a time here, just being involved in our Next Generation Ministries here at Bayside that is just like really has been the most impactful for you. So think about everything you've been a part of, everything you've done, every relationship you've been in, maybe just one thing from each of you guys that has been incredibly impactful to your life and your walk with God.
12 Conference is coming up, and 12 Conference is like the best thing ever. So basically, they have guest speakers come, it's a ton of worship, and it's so much fun, and it's so fulfilling to just see everyone coming together and worshiping, and it's so much fun.
Let me ask you this, let me follow up with that. So Claudia, so you talk about that, and that was a great plug for 12 Conference, I liked it. But how personally did that impact you? So seeing other students worshiping and engaging with God and seeing this place packed out with thousands of your peers, how did that impact you personally?
So I was here with my sister, and my sister is an amazing person, and she's so in love with God, and I love her for that. And she's just so inspiring to me because I see her grow in her relationship with God, and it's just so inspiring and so amazing to see.
That's awesome. I love that. Very cool. Bryce, what about you, man?
I would say small groups. Small groups for sure, yeah. I really got involved with Epic because from the result of a small group. Like I met Will at this small group. It was led by Nate Price, who is one of the Next Generation pastors at West Sarasota. And it kind of gave me this outlet to where I can see real people like living their lives outside of church. And that's something that I never really used to see before, like real Christian people living outside of church.
So good.
And that had a giant impact on me. And now, because of that small group and because of those moments that I had with all my friends, that I'm serving where I'm at now. So
that's so cool. Love it. Go ahead, Will.
It's so hard to pick one thing that has impacted me the most about being a part of this church, but I'd say probably just all the relationships I've made up until this point. Like ever since I walked indoors, like I've made so many relationships, and because of Bayside, like I know that these relationships are here to stay. Like they're not momentary, like they're gonna last my whole life, whether it's friends I made in Fusion or Epic or in SG Bayside or in just on weekend services. Like the relationships I made in the Next Gen have done, they're so good to me. Like the reason I love getting involved in like serving in the Next Generation Ministries is because I want to do everything I can to sort of give back what they've done to me. Because in the Next Generation Ministries, like that's where I found like my purpose and my calling, and that's really worth more than anything. And so I love just serving and getting the chance to give back and help raise up the next generation under me. So just the relationships I've made have just been so impactful here.
So awesome. That's awesome. So what, can we give it up for the panel, guys? Let's give it up for them. Thank you, guys. So awesome. Man, I don't know about you guys. I find that so incredibly encouraging to hear those stories. And, I think a lot of times what happens in our culture is that we really kind of focus on all of the negative things surrounding our culture, right? All the negative things surrounding our young people. And we hear things like how this generation is just lazy and they're not willing to work for anything. And, they don't know how to interact with people. And we focus so much on all of the negative things happening in this generation. And I get it, because the truth is, as we look around at what's happening in our world, we look around at what's happening in our country, I get it. It can be a little bit disheartening, and I think there's some things that we do need to be aware of. It's interesting, if you've been around church for any length of time, the church as a whole, and I don't mean Bayside, I mean the church, we've identified these regions of the world, these geographical regions that we've said, these are the most unreached people in the entire world, and it's been these geographical regions of the world. But for the first time, or at least for the first time in my lifetime, church, that's no longer a geographical region, it's actually an age demographic. And so the most unreached people in the entire world are those under the age of 30. most unreached people group in the world. And here's what's kind of staggering and sobering about that stat. I want you to think about that in the context of our country for just a second. Roughly right now, 30% of the generation who's kind of leading the way in our country, 30% of them are roughly Christ followers. Right now in our country, of those under the age of 30, roughly 4% are Christ followers. And what I want you to catch that's so significant about this is that we literally could be on the verge of becoming like a postmodern Europe, where for the first time in the history of our country, we could have a generation who doesn't even know who Jesus is, let alone follow him. And so I know we see things like that, we hear things like that, and it can be disheartening, right? Some of you are like, man, I'm really bummed out. Thank you so much for sharing that. And it can be kind of disheartening, and it can kind of be discouraging, but here's the cool thing is this. The good news is that every day I see something different. Every day I see something different happening in our young people. You know, these stories that you just heard and these testaments of what God is doing in these young people's lives, guys, that is really just a small snapshot of a much bigger picture of what God is doing in this generation and in our young people. And so listen, it's so cool because every weekend I get to see middle school students leading worship. I get to see middle school students serving. I get to see high school students leading worship from the platform and going on missions trips and leading small groups for their peers. I see kids in our kids ministries who are memorizing scriptures and serving on the weekend and honestly raising money to help people in need. See, I see something a little bit different. In fact, a few years ago, I took a group of middle school students on a missions trip to El Salvador. And we were down there and we're working throughout the week and doing ministry. And these kids are, it was incredible. Like they're doing work projects, they're preaching, like they're praying for people, leading people to Christ. And I'll never forget this. It was like our last day in El Salvador. And we sit down across the table from this local pastor and of what was a pretty healthy and vibrant church there in the capital of El Salvador. And he looked across and he goes, hey, what age group is this that you have with you? And I said, well, in the States we call them middle school, but I'm like, most of them are like 11, 12, 13. And he had this look on his face and he was just completely blown away. He said, I've got to tell you, here at our church, but really anywhere in this entire country, he goes, nobody really focuses on that age group. He said, we do some stuff for like older teenagers into their 20s, but we kind of have written off that younger group of students. He goes, but I have been so impressed with what I have seen this week. I'm seeing these young students leading people to Jesus and serving and working. He goes, I've been so impressed that we're going to start a middle school ministry for that age group at our church and start to reach them. It's so encouraging, and I know we can get caught up in all the negative things happening in our culture and with this generation, but I'm telling you, church, there's something greater happening. And what this generation really needs is for those generations who have gone before to start to believe in them and to start to invest in them. Come on, you can clap for that. That's true. I want to share with you guys today, this is a passage of scripture found in Genesis chapter 35. And just to set this up for you, there's a couple by the names of Jacob and Rachel. And basically, God shows up to them. He speaks to them. He gives them this huge vision for their life. He tells Jacob, hey, your name's now going to be Israel. You're going to be the father of many nations. Tells him to be fruitful and multiply. And actually, they go on this journey following God's will for their life. And Rachel is pregnant with child as they're on this journey. And I want you to take a look with me at what happens in Genesis 35, starting in verse 16. It says, then they journeyed from Bethel, and then when there was still some distance to go to Ephrath, Rachel began to give birth, and she suffered a severe labor. When she was in severe labor, the midwife said to her, do not fear, for now you have another son. It came about as her soul was departing, for she died, and then she named her son Benoni. I want to pause right here for just a second, church, and I want you guys to catch the significance of what is happening. So here's what should be this incredibly joyous occasion in Rachel and Jacob's life. She has a new son, she's giving birth to a child, but in the midst of her giving birth to her son, she finds that it's this really intense labor, and as she's giving birth, she is actually dying. She literally is dying, and so as she takes her last breath, she looks at her son and she names him Benoni, which means son of my sorrow. Son of my sorrow. So I want you to catch this. In the midst of her pain, in the midst of what was a dark moment for her in pain and suffering, she projected that on to her son. Son of my sorrow. And church, here's the question I want to ask us today. how often have we done the same thing? How often, because of the pain we've experienced in life, because of the hurt we've experienced in life, maybe some of us grew up where our parents were absent or worse, and maybe because of some of the pain that we have experienced in our own life, how often do we sometimes, even if it's unintentional, we project that on to the next generation? We project that on to the next generation. So she calls him son of my sorrow. But I want you to keep reading with me in verse 18. Simple statement right here. But his father called him Benjamin. And this is super significant, and I don't, it doesn't really tell us exactly how this moment played out, but here's what I kind of visualize. I can see Jacob walking in, probably being kind of emotionally torn because on one end, like his wife has just died, but then having a little bit of joy on the other side because he has this new son. And I can just visualize in my head, they hand Jacob his new son and they say, hey, here's your son, and his name is son of your sorrow. And I can just see Jacob saying, no, hold up a second. He's my son, but his name is not going to be Benoni. His name is not going to be son of my sorrow. His name is going to be Benjamin, son of my right hand. Come on, son of my right hand. Listen, I want to say this to you, that maybe some of you, you've had people in your life, a parent, a teacher, a coach, somebody in your life who has said things to you, who is maybe even from a place of their own pain has projected some things onto you. Maybe they've said that you're worthless, you're hopeless, you're not good enough, you don't have what it takes. And maybe you've started to believe those things. But if that's you, here's what I want to say to you. If you find yourself in that place, I want you to understand that God wants to change your name. God wants to change your name. You know, it was interesting the other day, I started drinking this, it's called tart cherry juice. And I know some of you are like, good, you're old, like, right? Like but I'm like, no, it's just, I've heard it's really good for you. So I'm pouring myself a glass of this tart cherry juice. And as I'm pouring this juice, I noticed that on the label, it says, concentrate from turkey. Some of y'all know where this is going. And so I pour this glass, and I'm literally, guys, I'm having this moment where I'm like, I'm so confused right now. Like, I don't understand that. I'm pouring, and I'm going, that makes no sense to me. And in my head, I'm going, why in the world would you take juice from a turkey and put it in cherry juice, right? I mean, I'm confused. I'm like, I do not understand. And so literally, I have this moment. I'm like 2 or 3 minutes in my head, I'm going, this doesn't make any sense. Like, I've been drinking this for a while that just doesn't, like, the product, that doesn't make sense. What I believe about the product is not lining up with what the label says about it. And so I'm like, this can't be right. I'm like, they must have mismarked this label. I go to my pantry, I get another bottle, and I look at it, and I'm looking for the label, and sure enough, concentrate from turkey. And I literally, guys, for several minutes, I'm just completely baffled. I'm like, I don't get it. I do not, this is disgusting. Why in the world would you put turkey juice in my cherry juice? I'm like, I'm not drinking this anymore, right? So I'm having this moment, and I promise you it's a little bit embarrassing, but this goes on for like 10 minutes in my head. Like, I'm home by myself, 10 minutes of me, and then finally, like, it kind of hit me, like, wow, smart. Listen, I'm from Alabama, so it just, you know what I mean? Like, but I pour this, and here's the reality, right? You can laugh, and we can, you know, get it. It was a kind of a dumb moment on my part. However, the reality is this: I was struggling because the label wasn't lining up with what I believed the product to be. And I would say this: some of you have people in your life who maybe from their own pain, from their own sorrow, from their own suffering, maybe they have projected that onto you. Maybe people have spoken some things over you that don't line up with who you really are. They don't line up with who God has really created you and designed you to be. And I want to say this to you: if you've had people speak those things over your life, I want you to understand that your identity doesn't come from what people say about you. It comes from who God says you are. You need to let that sink in, church. Church, let me ask you, what would happen in our culture and in this generation if we start, instead of constantly pointing out all of the negative things that we see in our young people, what if we started speaking life? What if we started calling out the positive things that we see? What if we started to speak to the potential that we see? Here's a thought, what if we started to identify young people based on their potential instead of the mistakes that they've made? What could happen in our culture? What could happen in our country? what could happen in our world, I believe this. I believe that 4% of young people who follow Christ would significantly start to change. And I know some of you are thinking, well, that's great, Pastor Matt, but how in the world could I make an impact in the next generation? How could I invest in them? How can I do that? The first thing I'll tell you is this. It starts at your home, right? It starts with your kids, with your grandkids, with your nieces, with your nephews. Listen, let me tell you something. This may come as a shock to some of you, and when you get home today, your students, especially if they're teenagers, may tell you something different. But let me speak to all the parents for just a second. I promise you, you have more influence in your student's life than anybody else ever will. You do. You have more influence in their life than you know you do. So invest in them. You know, you heard some of these students talking about the ministries here at Bayside. Listen, you could get involved serving here. Get involved in our kids' ministries, our middle school, our high school ministries. You know, come be a part this summer of 12 conference. You could serve young people and invest in them there. Or our kids camp this summer. There's all kinds of ways you can invest in the next generation. Church, you can make a difference. You know, I remember being in middle school and high school in those years of my life, and I had a youth pastor who really believed in me. He saw potential in me, guys, when I didn't see it in myself. He saw something in me that I never even realized was in there, and he began to call it out. He began to invest in me. He began to speak not to who I was at the moment, not to the circumstances, not to the mistakes that I had made, but he began to speak to the potential that he saw in me. And I can tell you today, church, I would not be here today doing what I am doing if it hadn't been for the investment that he made in my life. Listen, you can make an impact. And I know some of you are thinking, well, that's great, but listen, I'm not like young and hip and trendy. And listen, I get it. Not all of you can be me. I mean, some of y'all laughed a little too hard and a little too long, actually. And I want to say that's hurtful. So if you want to apologize to me later, you can come find me after service. Truth is this, sometimes we write ourselves off and we think, man, I'm too old, or I'm not cool enough to invest in young people. But I want to tell you this, I remember that same time frame in my life. I was probably 14, 15 years old. And there was this lady, we called her Miss Erica, and she was probably 60 years old. And just looking at Miss Erica from the exterior, you might not think to yourself, ideal youth leader, right? You might not think like, hey, she'd be great working with teenagers. But I want to tell you something. She had a heart for the next generation. And she loved and encouraged and poured. Listen, I'm telling you, she is one of the greatest influencers in my life. The woman taught me how to pray. She taught me what it meant to have faith. She encouraged me. She saw potential in me. She called it out. And there were times where she was very real with me. She spoke the truth in love. And sometimes she said things I didn't want to hear, but she was doing it so that I could become the person that God had wanted me to become. Listen, and I hear a lot of cheering, and I hear the young people cheering, but let me say this for just a second. You might not cheer. Listen, all the young people. I'm specifically speaking right now to everyone at our campuses, everyone watching under the age of 30, and I want to tell you something. There is this epidemic right now in our culture of being oversensitive. There's this epidemic going on in our culture where, hey, we don't ever want anybody to say anything that comes across harsh at all, because if it does, they're attacking me personally. Let me tell you something. You need people in your life who love you enough to speak the truth in love. And because here's the truth you need to get, listen, church, young people, there are people that God has placed in your life who see the potential in you, and they are trying to help you. And maybe, just maybe, God has put that person in your life so that you can become everything that he's called you and created you to be. So listen, allow that. Listen, you can make an impact in the next generation. Church, I want to encourage you with this. Let's be part of the solution. Let's not continue to add to the problem. Listen, the young people, all of our young people, this next generation, the truth is they are our future, and the future is now. Come on. If you would right now across all of our campuses, would you go ahead and bow your heads and close your eyes? God, I thank you so much for this weekend. God, I thank you, God, for lead pastors who care and genuinely love the next generation and who have made such an investment in our young people. God, I know that we can look around at all the things going on in the world and we can be incredibly discouraged, God, by what we see in this next generation. God, but help us to leave this place today encouraged. God, seeing that life change is happening, seeing these young people who are rising up, who are taking a stand, who are making a choice to pursue Christ. And help us, the generations who have gone before, help us, God, to invest in the next generation. God, help us to speak life and not death. Help us to begin to speak to the potential and not the mistakes. God, and I pray that you would begin to do something in this culture, God, that God, even though the statistics tell us something really negative, God, I thank you that you can turn that around. God, use our young people to do it and help us to truly invest in them. We thank you for it in Jesus' name. Amen.